regard. You have schedules. I just want to note a couple scheduling notes. First, tomorrow I think breakfast is at 7:15, and then it's later on Sunday. I know there's a group of you who want to pray the rosary before breakfast, and so just a half hour before whatever time breakfast is. So tomorrow breakfast is at 7:15, so at 6:45, if you want to pray the rosary with the group, they'll be meeting in the chapel, and we'll do that again on Sunday. Also, you'll note in the schedules that we have confessions both tomorrow afternoon and tomorrow evening. Now we have 50% more confessors Saturday evening than Saturday afternoon, so you might want to just plan accordingly, but I think between the two time slots we have that covered. And also for those of you who are live streaming, I'm not sure if the schedule has been posted. We'll try to remedy that, but if not, just know that the next talk after this one, what time is that at 9:30 tomorrow? 8:30 tomorrow. And there'll be two talks back to back tomorrow morning. So if you're watching tonight and you want to watch it in real time, the next one will be at 8:30. So I think that's, anybody have any questions? Let's just bring on our speaker, shall we? Our retreat master is Father Tim Gallagher of the Oblates of the Virgin Mary. He is currently the St. Ignatius Chair for Spiritual Formation at St. John Vianney Theological Seminary in Denver. He has an international reputation as author, retreat master, and spiritual guide. And this is a particular treat for me because, as some of you may know, in the mid-1980s, I spent some time with the Oblates of the Virgin Mary. And when I was a postulant in the mid-80s, guess who one of the young priest directors was at that time? None other than Father Tim. And it's very moving for me to even recall those days. I was blessed to have Father Tim as a retreat master, homilist at many formation masses. He did a course at Vatican II and other courses that we would take. He had an impact. He had an impact on me that has lasted 35 years. I can't think of too many people who have done that. Between it just how I think about the church, how I try to remain balanced amidst just competing ideas and factions, how to start again after a fall. All those things, just Father Tim was just so pivotal in his clear teaching, rooted in the teaching of St. Ignatius. So I'm glad he's able to give you guys a taste of that tonight. You guys are in for a real treat. So here's Father Tim Gallagher.
That was the nicest introduction I've ever received. I'm saying that because it's true. And also, let me say on the other end, it was 35 years ago, was it, Leon, that you were with us? But we all remember Leon very fondly. And I told Leon that our members send greetings with me on my way here to Leon. I'll also say this. I told Leon this afternoon. Of all the students I had, I was a fledgling teacher then. You're kind of nervous. You're not quite sure. And I was always, Leon was probably the best student I ever had, and was very kind to me as a teacher, never embarrassed me. So it's special for me too, just to be here and then to be with you. Well, let's lift our hearts to Our Lady. This is Our Lady of Consolation, honored in a Marian shrine. And in the way that St. John Paul II did so often, let's entrust this weekend to Mary, in the very sure confidence that placed in her mother's heart our mutual poverty, the poverty with which I can speak and the limitations with which you can listen, will be filled with a grace that will bring the fruit that brought us here and that we hope for in these days. So With great confidence and from our hearts, let's pray the Hail Mary, placing these days in her heart. Hail Mary, full of grace. So our topic is the discernment of spirits in the teaching of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Now, I would imagine that if most of us were asked to answer that question, what is discernment of spirits, we probably would hesitate a little bit and be not quite sure about how clearly we could answer that question. That term discernment of spirits is both inviting and a little mysterious, and it can conjure up a sense, maybe, for example, of a Jesuit retreat master off in a retreat house someplace, or those kinds of things. Very simply, what discernment of spirits means is this. You and I all know that there are times when in the spiritual life, in just our daily spiritual life, in which we feel God's closeness, when prayer is alive. We rise from prayer, the Deacons, the Liturgy of the Hours, the Eucharist, preaching, any of us in our personal life of prayer, with a sense that we've been close to God, and there's energy now spiritually for the day. And there's a desire to go deeper into the vocation, to live our marriage more fully, for example. And then if we're honest, we'll also recognize that there are other times, and we don't at times even understand why. There are times when the bottom just seems to drop out of that energy. And then if we're honest, if I may say it reverently, on such days we don't want to pray, or barely want to pray. We may pray, but it might be shorter, or the quality might be less than we would really hope for. We don't feel God's closeness as we go through the day. It can weigh on us to have to do the next thing in the parish, or at home, or in our marriage, or at work. The energy for new steps in the spiritual life is just not there. You pray the Liturgy of the Hours, it just feels kind of dry. These ups and downs are going on all the time in the spiritual life. Now, Ignatius of Loyola is not the only one in the Church's spiritual tradition who has described this kind of daily up and down spiritual experience. But no one else in the Church's tradition, on which he leans certainly, no one else in the Church's tradition has described this experience with the same clarity and practicality and usability with which Ignatius of Loyola does. The other question is, why St. Ignatius? There's not a Jesuit in the room, I believe, right? Sometimes I'll have a few hundred people in front of me, and now with virtual events even more, and there's maybe not a Jesuit involved. Why will a group of men and women, none of whom are Jesuits, dedicate a weekend to looking at the teaching of Ignatius of Loyola? It's a fair question. Just as not only the Franciscans, but all who want to grow in gospel simplicity, gospel poverty of life, readily look to Francis of Assisi. Think of the name of our present Pope, for example. And just as not only the Carmelites, but all in the church who want to grow in knowledge and experience of the higher states of prayer, turn to Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. And just as not only the Benedictines, but all in the church who want to grow in love of the liturgy, skill and a devotion to, in the practice of the liturgy, look to Benedict and the Benedictine tradition. In the same way, not only the Jesuits, but all in the church who want to learn more about and grow in discernment, which is so important in the spiritual life, look to Ignatius of Loyola. He is not the obviously exclusive figure who has talked about this in the Church's tradition, but as I've just said, there is no one else in the Church's tradition who has spoken with the same clarity and practicality as Ignatius of Loyola. His teaching on discernment is a gift that the Spirit gave to not just to the Jesuits, but through Ignatius gave to the entirety of the Church, and Pope after Pope has recognized this. So that's why a group of people, none of whom are Jesuits, are going to spend time looking at Ignatius of Loyola. And now let's get a little closer to the Sacrament of Orders and Discernment. And I'll approach this through the most recent document of the Church. This is preparation, formation toward priesthood, but it obviously applies to deacons very much as well. And what I did when this document came out was to just do a word search for discernment. You can do this yourself if you want, it's online. And I'm just going to pull out some of the adjectives that the document uses when it speaks of discernment. And that's, again, we're looking at the question of why are we going to spend time looking at this teaching on discernment. So the document speaks of vocational discernment, which will be very real for all of us here. When you wondered, is God calling me to the diaconate? You went through a discernment of that vocation. Obviously, you wanted to do that well. You wanted to be competent to do it well, to have the help and the clarity and the tools that you needed. The document speaks about serious discernment. When you make decisions about whether it's ministry, family, and so forth, and you seek God's will, do you do it seriously? Do you know how to do it seriously? And so the Church is saying those who are called to orders need to be prepared to do this. The document speaks of an ongoing path of discernment. So discernment, as the Church understands it, for those in holy orders, is not simply vocational discernment, that's done and behind me. But this is a whole way of life. It's ongoing, every day, as we live our life in the Church. And again, we need to be competent to do that. Apostolic, if I don't trip over, we'll continue here. Apostolic discernment. So you're making decisions about your ministry. Will I put my energies into this or into that? Does the parish need to do this or to do that? On what basis are you making those choices? And the Church is calling us to what she calls apostolic discernment. Pastoral discernment, about which Pope Francis speaks so frequently, so that when people come to you and ask your help in this or that aspect of the spiritual life, on what basis are you answering? How do you discern what the right answer in that pastoral situation is to be? Again, we need to be competent in discernment to do that. The document speaks of constant discernment. This is all the way through our lives in holy orders. And then evangelical discernment. When we do discern, I think God wants this and not that. Are we doing that on the basis of the gospel? Are we trained in that? Are we able to do that? Just dream of a body of deacons who are capable and living real gospel discernment in the choices that they make, seeking God's will, and it's based on the gospel. Right discernment, which is something like what the Church philosophy speaks, the perennial philosophy calls right reason. When we're using reason well, right discernment, when we're discerning well. All right, those adjectives alone tell us that this is something pretty fundamental to living our lives in the sacrament of holy orders. It merits even the short time that we'll have this weekend to dive into it. And what I'd like to suggest as a way of entering into this is to take a text from what's called the Autobiography of St. Ignatius. Do you have the handouts? I should. You need those every time we meet. Please bring all the handouts every time we meet. If you don't have it, it's actually, this text will be in the book, but it's best if you have it right there. This page from the Autobiography of St. Ignatius is probably the most famous page of the writings of Ignatius. It's actually the text that we use in the Office of Readings the Church gives us on July 31st for his memorial. And it gives us the moment, the pivotal moment in his life, the moment of his conversion at age 30. Now, if you look at the first sentence of it, it doesn't read like an autobiography. Autobiographies you expect to read like this: I made this choice, I went there, I did this. But this one doesn't. As he read them over many times, he became rather fond of what he found written and so forth. It reads like somebody else writing about Ignatius rather than Ignatius writing about himself. And the reason for that is that in the latter years of his life, Ignatius' Jesuit companions begged him so insistently to tell them something of how he had come to the Lord in his earlier years that Ignatius finally understood that the Lord wanted this. And he sat down on a number of occasions with this Portuguese Jesuit, Luis Gonçalves da Câmara, and just talked about those earlier years. And then Father da Camera later sat down and wrote down what Ignatius said, which is why we have an autobiography that reads the way this one does. Have I said that clearly enough, just so that we know what the text is? Now, as a background to this text, which gives us his conversion. Conversion from what? What was going on until age 30 in Ignatius' life? There is what I would call a spectrum of sanctity. On one end of the spectrum, you have people who at some point in their lives are very far from God, have powerful conversions, and begin to move toward God in lives that become very holy. What saint or saints easily comes to mind when I mention that model of sanctity? Just anyone. Yeah, Saint Augustine would, but somebody mentioned somebody else. Who else? Francis, I'd say yes, but not quite as decisively as Augustine, I'd say. He was never quite an Augustine, although he was a little wayward. Probably Augustine is the saint that would most easily come to mind when we mention that model of sanctity. And then with all sorts of nuances across the spectrum, on the far end, you have people who just seem to start close to God and then just keep getting closer. What saint or saints comes to mind when I mention that model of? Yeah, probably the primary one that would come to mind would be Saint Therese. I think in our own time, Saint John Paul II fits that model. Dorothy? Well, Dorothy Day will be a little bit more like Augustine, actually, you know. Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa of Calcutta, Saint John Bosco, and many others. Now, until the age of 30, on that spectrum, Ignatius is solidly over here with Augustine. One gentle way of saying it is this. In terms of the 10 commandments during those years, with the exception of the second commandment, which Ignatius always felt was unworthy of anyone to speak of God that way, and he would never do that. But with the exception of the second commandment, in those years, there probably was not one that Ignatius did not break in some pretty serious way. And some anecdotes of this. When Ignatius is 24 years old, he goes back up to his native town of Aspatia. And that night, together with one of his brothers, Ignatius commits what the legal document conserves simply calls an enormous crime. It's discovered in the morning. Ignatius immediately flees, or he would have certainly fallen into the hands of the law, as he eventually would over this issue. We also have documents which show Ignatius for 3 consecutive years asking permission of the King of Spain to carry a sword in public. Probably something like today, you know, legal permission to bear firearms in public and so forth. And also to be accompanied, that is Ignatius' sword, preserved in an altar in a church in Barcelona. And also to be accompanied by 2 attendants. And the reason that Ignatius gives is that there is a man who is utterly determined to take his life. And in fact, this man takes steps toward that goal, both in the city where these events initially happen, and later when Ignatius goes to Pamplona. Now, we don't know what Ignatius did to so intensely anger this man, but knowing the way he was living in those years, together with the biographers who recount this, I think we can say it's probably not too hard, at least to make a pretty reasonable guess at what was going on there. And then finally, when Ignatius does go to Pamplona, one day he is walking through one of the narrow streets of this old Spanish city, and there are political tensions behind this. And a group of young men come up the street in the opposite direction, and they push Ignatius up against the wall. And the witnesses tell us that if the bystanders had not restrained Ignatius, he would have drawn his sword and either killed or been killed. This is Ignatius until the age of 30, filled with dreams of feats of arms and romantic exploits and deeds of chivalry and honor and glory in this way. And then the French send an army south of the border to take this Spanish city of Pamplona. When the city sees the size of the French army and the battery of cannons and the rest, the city recognizes they cannot possibly withstand the attack, and so the city simply surrenders, all except for the castle. And the reason the castle does not surrender is because Ignatius is there, who considers it shameful in any circumstance simply to surrender, and inspires what they all know is a hopeless defense. But Ignatius was never easy to resist, whether first worldly or later given to God. And when the French realize that the castle is not going to surrender, they simply bring their cannons to bear and begin the bombardment of the walls. The walls begin to crumble, and in the course of the bombardment, a cannonball passes between Ignatius' legs and he falls. It damages the left, but completely shatters the right. And with Ignatius' fall, the rest of the defenders immediately surrender. And Ignatius tells us in the Autobiography that the French were so impressed by the courage of this 30-year-old Spaniard that they treated him with great respect, and in fact themselves, a journey of several days, took him on a stretcher back to his native home in northern Spain. That's a statue which commemorates that journey back from the battlefield. And this is an artist's rendering of the home of the Loyola family. It's still there, actually, if you ever go there, but now it's surrounded by a large Jesuit complex and retreat center. And everything that will follow takes place in that upper fourth-story floor where Ignatius undergoes the surgeries and his convalescence. That's what that floor looks like today. It's a chapel where all the pilgrims to the site go. Now, when the doctors look at Ignatius' leg, they tell him that, the right leg, that whether because the French surgeons set the leg badly on the battlefield or because the bones were jostled out of position during the trip home, the bones are not properly aligned, and the leg is not going to heal unless they're rebroken and reset. Now keep in mind, there was no anesthesia in those days. And they do it. They go through what Ignatius calls this butchery. And he tells us that he goes through it with no sign of pain other than the tight clenching of the fists. You know, there's that manly ideal that Ignatius has, you know, at this point in his life. Ignatius, after the surgery, comes to the point of death and then slowly begins to recover. And when he is well enough to take a look and notice the state of his right leg, he sees that in this surgery, the doctors beneath the knee have left one bone on top of another. So there's a very large and ugly protruding piece of bone there on the leg beneath the knee. Now, if you consider this is King Charles of Spain, who was king in these very years, you can see that refined, noble Spanish dress at the time called for these tight stocking-like garments up to above the knee, so that very visibly and sort of unseemly protruding bone beneath the knee is a social disfigurement. And Ignatius refuses to go through life like this. And so he insists with the doctors that they re-break the bones and reset them. This time the doctors themselves hesitate because the leg is fully healed. This is not going to be quick or easy, basically cutting away the protruding bone. But again, Ignatius has his way, and the surgery is done. Ignatius tells us again that he endured it with his customary patience and suffered martyrdom, as you can imagine, for many days afterwards. Now, the right leg obviously is a little shorter than the left, and in fact, Ignatius would limp a little for the rest of his life. And the doctors apply weights and ointments and so forth to do the best they can to stretch the leg. Eventually, a time comes when Ignatius is well in every way except that he can't walk. He can't get up from the bed. And so the time hangs heavily on his hands, and in order to pass the time, he asks for reading. Now, he tells us in the Autobiography that what he has in mind is the kind of reading he was used to doing. It's the kind of reading that's parodied in Don Quixote, for example. You know, again, romantic exploits and feats of arms and chivalry and battles and honor and glory and these sorts of things. But his sister-in-law, who is the lady of the house, gives him the only two books that she has. And one is A Life of Christ with meditations on the life of Christ, and the other is a volume with lives of the saints. And somewhat unwillingly, but to pass the time, Ignatius begins to read. And now, if you'll take your text, let's read how Ignatius' description of what follows. As he read them over many times, these two books, he became rather fond of what he found written there. This is a whole new kind of reading. He's never done this before. Putting his reading aside, he sometimes stopped to think about the things he had read and at other times about the things of the world that he used to think about before. Now, if you'll pardon me, I'm just going to introduce this simple paradigm, and you'll see in just a couple minutes why I'm doing this. By head, obviously, I mean thoughts, reasoning, concepts, logic, and so forth. And by heart, I mean feelings, emotions, affective stirrings, joy, sorrow, anxiety, hope, and so forth. In terms of that paradigm, head and heart, on what level is the experience at this point? Putting his reading aside, he sometimes stopped to think about the things he had read, and at other times about the things of the world that he used to think about before. Obviously, we're on which level, anyone? Yeah, and again, pardon me for asking such obvious questions, but you'll quickly see why we're doing this. Which immediately makes an important point for the whole of the spiritual life. The way we think has a lot to say about what happens in our spiritual lives. And in particular, one thought focuses his energies. Of the many vain things that presented themselves to him, one took such a hold on his heart that he was absorbed in thinking about it for 2 or 3 or 4 hours without realizing it. That's pretty remarkable. I wonder if anyone in the room has ever come to him or herself with a start and realized that I was so engaged in a set of thoughts that 2, 3, 4 hours went by and I didn't even realize it. You can just see the intensity of the engagement. And engagement in what thought? He details this now. He imagined what he would do in the service of a certain lady, the means he would take so he could go to the country where she lived, the verses, the words he would say to her, the deeds of arms he would do in her service. He became so conceited with this that he did not consider how impossible it would be, because the lady was not of the lower nobility, like Ignatius himself, nor a countess, nor a duchess, but her station was higher than any of these. Ever since I started public speaking, I've become very grateful for what St. Francis calls our sister water. You know, praise be God per sora nostra aqua. And he has the most beautiful description of it, I think, in all of literature, which is very humble, chaste, precious, and useful. It's a beautiful description of water. Close that parenthesis. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, the Jesuit scholars over the centuries have explored the identity of this woman. As far as we know, this was all Ignatius ever said about this. We have no record that he ever spoke about it in any other setting. One of the very real hypotheses is that this was Catherine. This was Catherine in later life as Queen of Portugal. She was young at that time. That this ideal lady whom he's pursuing in his thoughts was Catherine, whom Ignatius would have seen on a few occasions earlier. Now, if in fact it was Catherine, there's a note of unreality in all of this, because even as Ignatius spends hours and hours, day after day, pondering how he's going to win the heart of this woman, she is in practice unattainable to him, because in the aristocratically layered culture of his day, Ignatius, who is a member of nobility, but very minor and local nobility, is never even going to be able to meet someone who is above the highest ranks of nobility and in all likely royalty. So that something doesn't ring true in this intense engagement. There's something that is not really anchored well in all of this. But grace is also working. Nevertheless, our Lord assisted him, causing other thoughts that arose from the things he read to follow these. While reading the life of our Lord and of the saints, he stopped to think, reasoning within himself. Same question, head or heart? What level are we on here? Anyone? Yeah, okay. He continues at this point in the description to be focusing on the thoughts. He stopped to think, reasoning within himself. And here's this famous question. What if I should do what St. Francis did? This man did heroic things for God. Why should I do less? What if I should do what St. Dominic did? And for the first time in his life, Ignatius is discovering another kind of heroism, another way of doing great things. And his first thought is, if they did it, why shouldn't I? So he pondered over many things that he found to be good, always proposing to himself what was difficult and serious, the penances and deeds of the saints. And as he proposed them, they seemed to him easy to accomplish, This is a man who, for the sake of his appearance, can ask that bone be cut away without anesthesia. Again, never anything halfway about Ignatius, whether first worldly or later given to God. There was stuff here for God to work with. But his every thought was to say to himself, St. Dominic did this, therefore I have to do it. St. Francis did this, therefore I have to do it. These thoughts also, like the thoughts about the more worldly project, pursuing the unattainable woman, lasted a good while, 2, 3, 4 hours. But when other matters intervened, the worldly thoughts mentioned above returned, and he always spent much time on them. This succession of such diverse thoughts, and what are the diverse thoughts? Either of the worldly deeds, the pursuit of the unattainable woman he wished to achieve, or of the deeds of God, living like Francis and Dominic and the other saints, that came to his imagination, lasted for a long time, and he always dwelt at length, probably hours, on the thought before him until he tired of it and put it aside and turned to other matters. Now, this brings us to the threshold of the moment that would change his life. So I want to focus the spiritual experience before we move into it. Ignatius speaks of this succession of such diverse thoughts. And as I mentioned, basically what's being played out here, what he calls the worldly thoughts, so let me call it the worldly project. Basically what's being expressed here is a return to the way he lived until the age of 30. And what's being expressed here in this, call it holy project of living like the saints, is a whole new way of living, which is now opening up before him as a possibility. So can you see that what's happening here matters? He's really going to be deciding what direction his life is going to go. And that's what he means by this succession of such diverse thoughts. So, play it out a bit. Here is an afternoon. Ignatius spends 2, 3, 4 hours pursuing what will call the worldly project, how he'll win the heart of the unattainable woman. Now, no matter how engaging a set of thoughts are, just humanly speaking, eventually your energies tire, sets the thoughts aside, goes on with the day. Here is the next afternoon. Ignatius spends 2, 3, 4 hours intensely engaged in thoughts of the holy project. What if I did what Francis did? Left everything, dedicated my life to God. What if I did what Dominic did? Spread God's word to a Europe that needs to hear it, and so forth. Again, no matter how engaging a set of thoughts are, eventually your energies tire. He sets the thoughts aside and goes on with the day. And this is what's going on, not with perfect symmetry like this, but essentially that's what's going on, is an alternation of intense engagement in thoughts about living in one direction, which really means return to the way he was living before he was wounded, or living in a very different direction, which would be completely new, and would be directed explicitly toward God and in imitation of the saints. And now the moment of grace comes. Yet there was this difference. When he was thinking about the things of the world, he took much delight in them. Delight. Is that a word on the level of head or heart? Can we see that the dimension of the heart has come into the experience now? When he was thinking about the things of the world, he took much delight in them. But afterwards, so after a few hours of thinking about it, when he was tired and put them aside, he found that he was dry and discontented. Again, head or heart, dry and discontented, obviously. Again, pardon the questions, but you'll quickly, it's just a way of highlighting something that's going to be very quickly important. Head or heart, obviously, dry and discontented. Isn't it nice to have someone ask questions that are so easy to answer? This is a stray thought. This is why I never finish anymore. But when I was provincial in our community, and so I had the responsibility for our men that a bishop has for his priests. We had a meeting. I had a meeting with 4 priests who were my council, and as we were starting, one of the priests said, "I don't have a pen." And I said, "A problem I can solve." It was the high point of the meeting for me. I loved it. Okay? Excuse me. On the level of the heart here, dry and discontented. But when he thought of going to Jerusalem barefoot, so doing what the saints did, and eating nothing but herbs and undergoing all the other rigors that he saw the saints had endured, not only was he consoled when he had these thoughts, consoled obviously, language on the level of the heart, not only was he consoled when he had these thoughts, but even after putting them aside, he remained content and happy, which again obviously is heart level language. He did not notice this, however, nor did he stop to ponder the difference, and here's the moment that changed everything, until one time his eyes were opened a little. That's actually what the artist is depicting here, this moment when Ignatius on his convalescent bed, when his eyes are opened a little. He did not notice this, however, nor did he stop to ponder the difference, until one time his eyes were opened a little, and he began to marvel at the difference. Oh, this has all been going on, and I didn't even know it. And now look what Ignatius does. Once he now realizes that these patterns in his heart are going on relative to these two different sets of thoughts about living one way or another, once he realizes this is happening, what does he do? He begins to reflect upon it. He thinks about it. He ponders it. He explores it, tries to understand what this means. You can see his teaching on discernment birthing here, or beginning. And to reflect upon it, and then he learns as he reflects, realizing from experience that some thoughts left him sad and others happy. That's what he notices for the first time when his eyes are opened a little. Little by little, he came to recognize, understand the difference between the spirits that agitated him, one from the demon and the other from God. So he becomes aware of this, his eyes are opened a little, he stops and ponders and reflects upon it until he can recognize the one spirit and the other. And this is what strikes him. This has been, both sets of thoughts are engaging, but one always leaves me sad and the other always leaves me happy. That's what he sees for the first time, and then he wants to know what's going on. What does this mean? What's being said through this? Why is that happening? Okay, if you look at the fourth paragraph of this text, let's do an exercise with Ignatius's own words. So there was this difference when he was thinking about the things of the world, he took what? Much what? He took much delight in them. But afterward, when he stops thinking about them, his heart is then what? Dry and discontented. While Ignatius is actually thinking the thoughts of living like the saints, his heart is what? It's actually the last full line in that paragraph. His heart is consoled. When he puts the thoughts aside and goes on with the day, his heart is now what? Okay, can you see that while Ignatius is actually thinking the thoughts, whether of the worldly project or of the holy project, can you see that there's a kind of equivalence on the heart level? Delight, consolation, both sets of thoughts while he's thinking about them awaken energy and enthusiasm and just fill him with energy. But can you also see that what happens after a few hours of thinking about one way of living and the other way of living, now what happens on the level of the heart is very different in the one case and the other. After he's been thinking about the worldly project, his heart remains dry, discontented, empty somehow, too superficial, not full. Something's missing. Something isn't right. Whereas when he's been thinking about living like the saints and then goes on with the day, his heart remains happy, content, fulfilled. Something feels right in his heart. Do we see that? Because that's what Ignatius notices when his eyes are opened a little. Once Ignatius realizes that this pattern is going on in his heart relative to the two different sets of thoughts, he takes action according. Well, before he takes action, let's just note the steps here because these are key. He notices this experience, he becomes aware of it. He reflects on it until he understands it. A set of thoughts which is engaging in itself, but which always leaves me feeling empty, does not have the feel of where God is leading in my life. Whereas another set of thoughts which is engaging in itself and always does leave my heart happy, that begins to have the feel of where God is leading in my life. That's what he means by reflecting until he can recognize which spirit is at work. He reflects until he understands its spiritual significance. And once he understands this, Ignatius takes action accordingly. As soon as his leg is healed, actually before it's fully healed, Ignatius leaves his home, walks away from everything, sets off riding across northern Spain on a mule, goes down to the Benedictine monastery of Montserrat, which is near Barcelona, and with the help of one of the Benedictine priests, spends 3 days preparing and then making a life-changing, it's a watershed confession. It covers those 30 years of wayward life until then. After that confession, he goes down to the small nearby city of Manresa. He'll spend about a year there. He lives in the hostel where the poor and the ill of the city are housed, serving them, assisting them in their needs, rising each morning to assist at Mass in one of the churches of this small city, and then returning in the evening to be present for the chanting of Vespers. And during the day, spending hours and hours and hours in a cave, and that's what the cave looks like today. It's a chapel in a large Jesuit retreat center. Spends hours and hours praying with Jesus in the Gospels, imitating even to excess the penitential austerities of the saints. He's new, he's fervent, he has no background or understanding of the spiritual life. Damages his health in some ways he'd carry for the rest of his life, and then finds a better balance with the help of a confessor. Does go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, returns to Barcelona, begins the studies that will lead to Paris and priesthood, and a life of holiness is underway. Now, let's ask this question. What if that day Ignatius's eyes had not been opened a little, enough to notice the spiritual experience going on in his heart relative to thinking about living one way or another, and working with it till he understood what was of God and not of God, and then taking action accordingly? What if his eyes had not been opened a little like this? What would have been different in his life? Would he have ever followed the path toward holiness that led him to become the saint that we know him to be? Certainly, at least minimally, we can say not in the way that he did, if at all. Because as you know, his whole intention when he was wounded was to heal and go right back to the way he was living. In all likelihood, he would have returned simply to the way he was living before. Let's ask another question. What if Ignatius' eyes had not been opened a little that day, enough to notice this spiritual experience, understand it, and take action accordingly? What would have been different in the life of his university companion, St. Francis Xavier, and the church in Asia? What would have been different not many years later in the life of Jesuit martyr St. Edmund Campion and the church in England? What would have been different not many years later in the life of Jesuit St. Peter Claver and the church in Latin America? What would have been different not many years later in the North American martyrs, the Jesuit North American martyrs and the church in Canada and in this country? Among many other things that would have been different, you and I would not be gathered in this room this evening doing what we're doing. The ripples of grace that have gone out into the church and the world, because one man's eyes spiritually were opened enough to begin to notice the spiritual experience that was going on every day in his heart and in his thoughts, and to understand what was of God and not of God in it, and to act accordingly. Those ripples continue to go out and bless the church and the world. And I would say that there probably has never been a time equal to today in the number of lay people who are benefiting from Ignatius' teaching. It's just exploding. Just 2 weekends ago, I had a seminar up in northern Michigan, but it was in person and virtual. Not for people who want to know the rules, but for people who know them and want to teach them to others. We had 300 people from around the world on this. This would not have even happened 3, let alone 5 or 10 years ago. Let's ask a second question. What will happen in your life as deacons and spouses and mine if we can begin, or if we've begun, can grow in living with our eyes opened a little, to be in touch with the spiritual experience that's always going on in our hearts and thoughts, understand what's of God and not of God, and take action accordingly. The same two things will happen in our lives with our individual nuances that happened in Ignatius' life. A rich step in growth toward personal holiness, which the church so needs today. It's the answer to all the problems. Holiness has always been the answer. And we will become, as Ignatius was so powerfully in his own time, agents of renewal in the church, or as the church says today, of a new evangelization. This is really what has kept me for 35, close to 40 years now, writing and speaking and teaching these rules, because they can make this difference. There's no magic in the spiritual life. Like prayer, it's something we have to grow in. But if we can understand this, this can make a real difference. And I can't tell you the countless times that I've seen this in people's lives. That's why it's worth spending time on this. Okay, from that experience, let's see where we are time-wise. Can you bear with me a bit longer? That's what's called a courtesy question. It expects the answer yes. Someday I'm going to get the answer no, and then I'm going to be in a little trouble. But would you take the handout that says the text of the rules? Well, here's another thing. There was a Eucharistic Congress in Ireland years back, and a few 100,000 people were gathered, and it was just about, the final Mass was just about to start, and the clouds were just about to pour down rain. And one elderly woman, as she got off the bus to join the crowd, is recorded as saying, "Well, Lord, all I can say is that if it rains, you've brought it on yourself." So if we go a little bit longer, you've brought it on yourself here. Okay, let's take a look at that title statement, those first 3 lines. And as we do, you'll see why I begin this with that experience of Ignatius, because he really codifies that experience in these first 3 lines. And what he's doing here is answering our initial question, what is discernment of spirits? So Ignatius tells us that what he's writing here is a set of rules, 14 of them. Now this word rule, when I first started teaching this back in the 1980s, people got uncomfortable with it. You know, America, live free or die, don't tread on me, just do it, all these sorts of things. It's very different today. What's the runaway bestseller translated into 50 languages, millions of copies sold about rules? Just anyone. 12 rules. 12 Rules for Life. Jordan Peterson's book, he's just written a second one. I looked it up today. 12 more rules. He published that just 8 months ago. It has 8,000 reviews on Amazon, which is just unheard of in that short amount of time. Rules. And as long as health permitted, he was getting tens of thousands of people coming to listen to him speak about rules. His subtitle is An Antidote to Chaos, because the culture has gotten so chaotic that rules now begin to be attractive. They're clear, they're usable, they'll get you through the chaos. I was teaching this at the Theology of the Body Institute just a couple years ago, and we got to this point, and in the break a woman approached me, and she told me of a pop song. I don't recommend the song. I have deliberately not watched the music video. I don't think you do want to watch it, but I'm interested in it just as a cultural phenomenon. The song is called New Rules, and it basically, the words tell the story of a woman who's been used by a man, doesn't want ever allow that to happen again, and so she has placed new rules. She has set up new rules so that that will never happen again. Anybody want to guess how many views that music video has had on YouTube? Anybody want to be bold and make a guess? 12 million? 250 million? Anybody willing to go way out on a limb and try anything further than that? A million? 2.5 billion. Rules. I looked up on Amazon, I just typed in Amazon Books, I typed in the word rules. What Amazon does is, if there are enough books that respond to that, it'll list them, it'll give you the number up to 70,000. And if it's more than 70,000, it just says more than 70,000. And that was what comes up. If you type in rules on Amazon Books, it'll come up and just say more than 70,000 rules. And 500 years ago, Ignatius came up with a set of 14 concrete, practical, understandable, usable rules to help us make sense out of this ebb and flow of spiritual experience that's always going on in our hearts and in our thoughts. All right, these are rules for, what's the first step in discernment? Rules for what? Rules for becoming aware. Can you see that moment when Ignatius' eyes are opened a little? That's the first step in discernment, is just to begin to notice the spiritual experience that's always going on in our hearts and in our heads, our thoughts, our hearts, and thoughts and hearts. May I reverently ask this? What was in your heart and thoughts this morning as you arose? Did you even notice? What's been in your heart and thoughts over the past 6 months, the past year? How much have you even noticed? And what might happen if you began to notice it? So that the rest could follow. You could begin to understand what's of God and not of God, and what to follow and not to follow. That's the power of the first step in discernment. These are rules for becoming aware. And what's the second step? Rules for becoming aware and what? Understanding. This is when Ignatius ponders, reflects on this experience, and realizes that these thoughts which leave me sad, that's not God. This set of thoughts which always leave me happy, that is where God is leading. Very reverently, one of us has gone through the past year in his diaconate, or the spouse, with a vague sense, it hasn't stopped him, but a vague sense that something isn't right somewhere in my spiritual life, and I don't know what it is, and it weighs upon me. There's just an edge of heaviness or grayness someplace. And then the moment comes when he knows what it is. He understands it now, which is wonderfully liberating, because now he can do something about it. He doesn't have to just passively bear it. Here is another one of us who has gone through the past year with a sense of new, deeper closeness with the Lord, a sense of God's love, a sense that God is calling him or her more deeply into his or her vocation, but hasn't seen how, where. And then the day comes when he sees it. He understands. This is what the call is, to take this step in the spiritual life or in my ministry. And again, it's joyfully liberating, because now he can go forward. That's the power of the second step in discernment. Rules for becoming aware and understanding to some extent. When Ignatius' eyes are opened, no, we've gone through some of this already. When Ignatius' eyes are opened, how much are they opened? Yeah, he doesn't see everything, but what he does see is all that God needs to dramatically transform his life. So in discernment of spirits, applying the rules, we aren't going to understand everything that's going on in our hearts and thoughts, but we will see enough to make a very rich difference. Let me just dream with you. I don't know how many deacons we are here, 45 or whatever we are, and spouses. Let me just dream of deacons and their spouses who are living this, able to be aware of this kind of spiritual experience and understand what's of God and not of God, and may be able to help others with it too. But you can't help others with it unless you're living it personally. It's one of the great gifts in my life, is that I teach this repeatedly, which always keeps it there, at my fingertips. I'm very grateful to the Lord for that. Okay, what are we becoming aware of and trying to understand to some extent? Rules for becoming aware and understanding to some extent the different movements that are caused in the soul. What does Ignatius mean by movements? This is the stuff that we look at in discernment of spirits. He means this ebb and flow that goes on in our hearts and in our heads. So in terms of that example from Ignatius himself, the movements that are there would be the delight, dryness, discontent, the consolation, the happiness, the contentment, and then I'll expand it. Other movements: fear, hope, anxiety, confidence, and their related thoughts. All of this stuff that's going on in our thoughts and in our hearts every day. This is what Ignatius means by the different movements, and advisedly movements, because they will move us in a certain direction depending on how we respond to them. We feel resistance towards something, we pull away. We feel attraction towards something, we want to move that way. is that resistance and that attraction of God or not? All right, that's what the discernment is going to help us understand. So that's what we look at. We look at the different movements that are caused in the soul. And then this brings us to the third, final, and active step. If the movements are good, what is the appropriate spiritual response? Ignatius says, to receive them, to accept them, to drink them in, to be guided by them, to put them into practice, as Ignatius does in pursuing the holy project with the fruits, the amazing fruits that we see in his life. And if the movements are bad, what is the only appropriate, not of God, what is obviously the only appropriate response to them? To reject them. The Spanish word is actually even more energetic, lanzar. In Spanish, when a pitcher in baseball is a lanzador, someone you just hurl these away from you spiritually so that they can never harm you. And then Ignatius situates them within his exercises, and these rules are more proper for the first week. Okay. Let's go back then to our initial question. What is discernment of spirits? And with Ignatius we answer, discernment of spirits is a spiritual action, or if you want to use his own word, discernment of spirits is a spiritual exercise that asks us to be aware of the experience going on in our hearts and in our thoughts. The spiritual experience going on in our hearts and thoughts. Once we are aware of it, to work with it until we understand what is of God and not of God in it. And having understood that, we take action accordingly. We accept, drink in, be guided by, put into practice what we know now to be of God, and firmly reject what we know not to be of God so that it can never lead us astray. That's Ignatius' purpose in those first 3 lines, is to answer the fundamental question of what do we mean by discernment of spirits. Now in the 14 rules to follow, he's going to show us how to do that in daily spiritual living. So let's see where we are time-wise now. Can I go just a couple more minutes? I know I'm risking now getting a no here. Let me go just a little bit longer here, if I may. Not much. I won't go past 50 minutes, which is another 5 minutes at the most. Ignatius, in the 14 rules to follow, will focus on the second 2 steps, giving us instruction so that we understand discernment, and especially giving us tools to bring it to life, to act on it. And so just a very brief moment, someday I wish I had a whole retreat on this awareness in the spiritual life, just noticing spiritual experience, because obviously if we don't even notice this experience, the rest of it won't follow. Awareness, our eyes opened enough to notice the spiritual experience that's always going on in our head and hearts, that's the gateway into the discerning life. And we began by looking at how important the church sees this to be for those in the sacrament of orders, certainly for every Christian. To be aware, and if we had more time I'd go into this more in depth, but this is Augustine in the Confessions when he looks back at those 20 years when he's so far from God, and he says to God, turns to God and says, you were within, into seras, you were within, et ego foris, and I was without. You called, you shouted, you broke through my deafness, you flashed, you shone, you dispelled my blindness. A powerful image of God powerfully at work in the human heart, calling, shouting, flashing, shining, and the human heart doesn't even hear it, doesn't even see it. You were within, but I was without, engaged in 1,000 plans and projects and concerns and so forth. Of course, God breaks through in Augustine, but we can live like that. Here's a question. In terms of Augustine's words, within, without, does our culture today live more habitually within or without? I've been asking that of groups for, say, 35 years in every kind of background, education, ethnic groups and so forth you can imagine. Not one person has ever doubted the answer to that question. If that's so, here's a deeper question. Why is that so? You know, I think I need to stop here. That's enough for a first night. But that's a profound question that you might want to discuss a little bit. And the answer really matters. Because, well, if you, I can go endlessly, but I am going to stop here. You might want to discuss that, because what we need if we're going to live the discerning life is what I call in the book the courage to be spiritually aware, which arises when we discover that to be within, far more than to encounter our own limitations, is to encounter the infinite, warm, personal, faithful, eternal love of the Savior, which is why evangelization will always precede discernment. Okay? Let's stop there for tonight. Maybe let's just pray in praise of the Trinity as we conclude. Let's say the glory be as we say it in the Liturgy of the Hours. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen. Amen.